I understand, said Panaloo. It's an outrage because it is beyond us, but perhaps we should love what we cannot understand. Ryu sat up abruptly. He looked at Panaloo with all the strength and passion he could muster and shook his head. No, father, he said. I have a different notion of love. And to the day I die, I shall refuse to love this creation in which children are tortured. A shadow of profound disease passed across Panaloo's face. Ah, doctor, he said sadly, I just understood what it means by God's grace. But Ryu had slipped back into the bench. From the depths of his returning exhaustion, he replied more gently, which I don't have, I know, but I don't want to discuss with you. We are working together for something that unties us at a higher level than prayer and blasphemy, and that's what counts. Panaloo sat down beside Ryu and seemed moved. Yes, he said. Yes, you too are working for the salvation of mankind. Ryu tried to smile. Salvation was too big a word for me. I don't go that far. What interests me is man's health, his health first of all. Panaloo hesitated. Doctor, he said. Then he stopped, and the sweat was also starting to run down his forehead. He muttered a goodbye, his eyes shone as he got up. He was about to leave when Ryu had been thinking, also got up and took a step towards him. Forgive me, he said. That outburst was not to be repeated. Panaloo held out his hand and said sadly, Yet I have not managed to convince you. What does it matter? Ryu asked. What I hate in death and evil, as you know, is whether to accept this or not. We are together in enduring them with the fighting against them. Ryu took Panaloo's hand. You see, he said deliberately, not meeting his eyes, even God himself cannot separate us now. Since he began the work of the health teams, Panaloo had not left the hospital and places where the plague had been to be found. He put himself amongst the rescuers in the position which he felt was by his right, namely in the front rank. He had seen death many times, and thought, in theory, he was protected by the serum, and the idea of his own death was also familiar to him. To all appearances, though he had kept calm, but from the day when he had to watch the hours while the child died, he seemed changed. His face showed the evidence of increasing stress. So when one day he told Ryu with a smile that he was just then preparing to sort of expose the subject, the priest consulted the doctor. Ryu got the impression that something more serious was involved, and Panaloo appeared to be telling him. The doctor said that he was interested to see the work. Panaloo announced that he was giving the serum at the men's mass, and that on this occasion he would develop at least some of his ideas. I'd like you to come, doctor. The subject will interest you. The priest gave the second sermon on the day of the high wind, and to tell the truth, the ranks of the congregation was less tidy and panicked than the previous occasion. The fact is that the kind of entertainment no longer had the appeal of novelty towards the fellow citizens. In the difficult circumstances the town was experiencing, the very word novelty had lost its meaning. Moreover, most people, when they had not entirely abandoned their religion duties, or managed to reconcile them with the profound immoral personal lives, had replaced ordinary observations with quiet, irrational separations. They were more likely to wear the protective charms and medallions of St. Roch than to go to Mass. As an example, one might point out the excessive use of the townspeople made of prophecies. In the spring, indeed, they expect the illness to end at any time, so no one bothered to speak of any information the deterioration of the epidemic because they had all convinced themselves that it would have none. But the more time passed and the people came to fear that the misfortune really would never end, and by the same token the ending of the epidemic became an object of everyone's hopes. So various prophecies by wise men or saints of the Catholic Church were passed around from one hand to the other. Printers of the towns very rapidly realized that the interest might be turned to be able to take advantage and publish many copies of the that were in circulation, finding that the public appetite was insustainable. They had come research that made the town libraries on all the ranks, so the kind that could be found in the highways of the byways, and the history spread them around town. When history itself proved to be a short of prophecy, there was commissions from journalists who proved that the respects at least to be the competitive of the counterparts of the earlier centuries. Some of the prophecies even appeared sterilized by the newspapers, who were read with quite an energies and love stories that were to be found. There were times of good health. Some productions were based on bizarre calculations involving the numbers of the year and the number of deaths and the number of months that had already spent under the plague. Others established comparisons with the Great Plague of history, bringing out the similarities, in which these prophecies called constants, and by means no less particular calculations claimed that the extent of information relative to the present outbreaks. But the ones of the public liked best were the undoubtable, in which the apocalyptic language announced a series of events, any in which might be the one the town was currently establishing their complexity, allowing the interruptions. The Nostradamus of the St. Odile were thus continuously, daily, and never in vain. What remained common among all the prophecies is that in the last resort they were reassuring. The plague, however, was not. Hence the separation took the place of the religion and our fellow citizens, and this is why Penelope's sermon was given to the church that was only 3/4 full. On the evening of the event, when Ryu arrived, the wind, in which was speeding in currents, the air through the great swinging doors in the front entrance, circulated freely among the congregation. So it was cold, silent church in the midst of the congregation excessively made up of men. And Ryu sat down and watched the priest set up into the pulpit. He spoke in a voice that was softer and more thoughtful than the previous occasion, and several times the listeners noticed a sort of hesitation in his delivery. Another particular thing, he no longer said you, but we. However, his voice got gradually stronger. He began by recalling that the plague had been among us for many long months, and that now we know it better than having seen it so many times settled at our table or by our bedsides of those we love, walking beside us and waiting for us to arrive at our place of work, so that we might hear what it had to ceaselessly telling us, but which it had been possible that in our first surprise we did not hear it very well. What Father Panlu had preached at the same place already remained true, at least so that he believed, but perhaps, as might happen as one of us, at this he beat his breast. He might have thought it as said that it without charity, however it remained true, was always in every circumstance there was something to be learned. The cruelest trial was to be beneficial for the Christians, and precisely what the Christians should seek, as the Christians was the only benefit, and to explain what was involved and how to be found. At that moment, around Ryu, people seemed to be settling against the armrests, and their benches were making themselves comfortable as they could. One of the platter doors entrance were flapping gently. Someone had gone to it fast, and Ryu distributed the movement and hastily listening to Paolu, who resumed his sermon. He was saying more or less that one must not try to explain the phenomenon of the plague, but attempt instead to learn what one could do from it. Ryu vaguely understood that, according to the priest, there was nothing to explain. Paolu captured the full attention when he said firmly that there was something that only could explain the sight of God, and others that one could not. Certainly there were such things as good and evil, and broadly speaking, one could easily understand what distinguished them. But it was inside the evil of the problem started. For example, there was apparently necessarily the evil and apparently unnecessarily ones. That was Don Juan cast into hell. There was the death of a child. While it was right for the libertine said that he could cast aside, one could not understand the suffering of a child. And in truth, there was nothing on this earth more important than the suffering of a child and the horror that was suffering brings with it. The explanation that had to be found for it. The other aspects of life, God made everything easy for us. So in that sense, there was no merit in religion. Here, on the other hand, it put us with our backs to the wall. It would have been easy for him to say that the eternity of joy awaits the child might compensate for his suffering, but in truth, he did not know about that. Who, in fact, could assess the eternity of the delighted that could compensate for the instant of human suffering? Surely not a Christian whose master had endured pain of his limbs and of his soul. No, when we faced with the suffering of the child, the priest would remain with his back to the wall, loyal to the painful disjunction symbolized by the cross. And he would, without fear of those who were listening to him on that day, "My brethren, the moment has come. One must believe everything or deny everything. And who among you would dare to deny everything?" Ryu had hardly time to think when the priest was getting close to the hasty before he already spoke again. Forcibly, he asserted that the injunction appeared to man was to benefit the Christian. It was also his virtue. The priest knew that there was something extreme about the virtue he was going to speak and which would shock many minds. He used the more traditional and indulgent morality, but resigned to the time of the plague, could not be the religion of every day, and if God could accept that, even wish that the soul could rest in happier times. He wanted it to be excessive when there was extreme unhappiness. Today God was doing his creation in the favor of putting them in such a misfortune that they were obliged to rediscover and take themselves to the great virtue, which was that of all or nothing. The secular writer of the last century claimed that they received the secrets of the church and stated that there was no such thing as purgatory, but that he implied that there was no half measures, and there was either heaven or hell, and that one could only be saved or damned, according to the choices one has made. If Penelue was to be believed, there was a hearsay of a kind that could only arise in the soul of a freethinker, because there was purgatory, but there was also surely true that were times that one should not hope too much for this purgatory. There were times that one could only speak of venial sin, and sin of the mortal of all forms, an indeficient criminal, if everything or nothing. Penelue stopped, letting Ryu hear the more clearly from beneath the doors of the house the wind that seemed to be increasing outside. At the same moment, the priest said that the virtue was total acceptance, and which he was speaking one could be understood in the restricted sense usually given to it. It was a matter of plain registration of the ever mean the hinder humanity, and the question of humiliation, but one in which the humiliated person considered. Certainly the suffering of the child was humiliating for the spirit of the body, but this is why one had to put it part of it, and that's why Penelue assured the listener that he would say it was not easy to say. You had to want it because God wanted it. Only in a way would a Christian spare nothing at all. With all the outlets closed off in his heart of the essential choice, he chose to believe everything so that not to be reduced to denying everything. And like those good women who once had learned the blue-bos, as they appeared on the natural means in which the body rejected infection, were the churches at this very moment saying, "Dear God, give him blue-bos." And the Christian must have learned to give in a divine will. And when the incomprehensible, one could say, "I understand this, but it's unacceptable," and had the leap of the heart in the unacceptable, and which was often to say precisely so that he could make the choice, and suffering of the children was our bitter bread. But without this bread, our soul would die of spiritual hunger. Here the suffering of the unusual accompanied Father Penelue paused. and stated that he heard the unexpected. The preacher resumed forcefully, apparently asking on behalf of the audience what was in the end of the proper way to behave. His gestures of the people who mentioned the dreadful word fatalism, well, he would not shrink from that term, but only if he was allowed to add the adjective active. Indeed, one more that should not intimidate the Christians of the Abilisine was whom he had spoken. They should not even consider the following of the Persian sufferers of the plague, who threw their rags at the Christians' sanitary packets, pleading aloud the heavens and begging God to give the plague to those infidels who were trying to fight against the evil that he had sent. On the other hand, one should not intimidate the monks of the Cairo, who had the epidemic that lasts centuries and could give communication, picking up the host of the pincers in order to avoid the contrast the moist or mouse in, and the infection might linger. The preachant suffered, and the monks were equally in the wrong. For the first of the suffering of the child did not count for the second of the very human fear and pain that had become the main consideration. For both cases the problem was being avoided, before the death of the voice of the God. But there were other examples that Father Panaloo would like to recall. And if we were to believe the chronicle of the Great Plague of Marseille, out of the 81 religious inhabitants of the Cave of Mercy, for only found survived in the fever, and these 3 fled. This is what most chronicles told us, and it was their business to say more. But when he read this, the thoughts of Father Panaloo went to one of the monks who remained alone in the spirit of 77 corpses above all the sprites, of the example of 3 brothers. The priest, hammering with his fist on the side of the pulpit, exclaimed, "My brethren, you must be the ones who stray." It was not a matter of talking precautions in the sensible order the society introduced, only to the chaos of the pestilence. One should not heed the mortals, and said that he shall fall down on his knees and abandon everything.